Hi, folks. Um, so we're continuing now. This video continues the topic of a short-run aggregate supply curve, and we're going to be moving you to what I think you could argue is a little bit more realistic view. So previously, we introduced you to this flat short-run aggregate supply curve. I'm getting my curves mixed up here, and the idea was that in the very, very shortest of run, nobody adjusts their prices, and then the purpose of telling you that, the purpose of that tool was to show you the linkage between the short run and the long run, because the idea was that, okay, when you have a money supply increase, initially no changes in prices, but then as people gradually adapt all of their prices to adjust to the fact that yes, there has been an increase in the money supply, and that meant aggregate demand, but no change to aggregate supply and no long run change to velocity. Then what happens is you can see this curve shifting upward, 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 until finally, in the long run, you get this classical result: 5% increase in money, 5% increase in prices, nothing else. Well, now you were going to modify that a little bit, and the idea is that, well, maybe in the short run, we will see an upward sloping supply curve, and I'm show that to you in a second. And really, this is not, most students don't even find this to be a big jump, but we just want to make sure you understand that we're just making things a little bit more realistic. So the idea here is that some prices are fixed, but not all prices are fixed in the short run. Some will vary. So some prices in even the very shortest run will be passed on to consumers, but ultimately we will get this gradual adjustment, once again, as a result of our money supply experiment. In terms of your reading, okay, so we've already assigned to you the Mankiw text, 409 through 417. He does a perfectly good job. He does an exquisite job, I would say, of doing that. At the same time, for those of you who want to tread into perhaps a little bit more difficult waters, I'd be very interested in your views on how, on my textbook, whether I'm also expressing this very important idea clearly. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go and we're going to review the tool, and I'm going to make the tool available to you, of course. So now, here we have the tool, and actually there's two sheets in this tool. One is we're going to look at a money supply change, but then we're also going to look at a supply shock. So let's think of a money supply change. Once again, you'll notice that this is exactly the same as before. We have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Okay, I do want to make sure that the version that I give you is nice and clean here. And then the upward sloping curve, the idea is that in the short run, you do have some prices, some increase in costs, we should say, are passed on to the final purchasers. So let's think about when we increase production in the short run. It can be more costly. We may have to pay higher wages, and also let's not forget about diminishing marginal productivity. Each of our extra workers becomes progressively less and less productive at the margin. They still positive, but diminishing marginal productivity. You may remember that for your micro class. So let's do a nice shock here. Once again, let's think of, let's say a 7% increase in the money supply. And you can see exactly what happens is that in the very shortest of runs, before people realize perhaps that there has been a money supply increase, this is what we call the misperceptions approach. Before that happens, even before that happens, in the very shortest of runs, some costs will increase, and some of those costs are passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, or to purchasers in general. Okay, then we get this gradual upward shifting of the curve, but now until finally we get back here to potential output, and we get back to an equiproportionate change in prices. The only thing now that we're adding to the story here is, why does this curve shift? And really there's two basic stories that economists like to give, and we discuss them. They're discussed in your textbook. The first is sort of misperception. So the idea is that initially people are not quite aware, fully aware, that the money supply has gone up, in this case by 7%. So if they're sort of confused about that, they will keep their prices as they were, and only gradually do people sort of realize, well, hey, something has changed here on a permanent basis. We had better adjust, even if in a gradual fashion, our pricing. And this is what happens, is that gradually, okay, we've put here 1/3, 2/3, and complete. As people realize that there has been this change in the money supply, this monetary expansion, which means a long run increase in demand, the price schedule of sellers changes, is adjusted, and as that happens, we're progressively moving along this new demand curve, and we're squeezing out more and more demand until we get back to potential output, but at a new higher price level. The other story we tell is that, well, maybe people do know, but they have contracts, and they may have an explicit contract. So let's say, for example, I'm selling you something, and for the next 5 years, I have agreed to sell you flat screen TVs for, let's say, $1,000, even though prices are going up. We can also have wages fixed by some contract, and the contract could be 2 years, 3 years. We call staggered contracts. Gradually, these contracts are sort of renegotiated, and only on a gradual basis do these newly negotiated contracts reflect the new reality of a higher price level. Okay, so either way, either we're fooled or we're not fooled, but our hands are tied. We will get, in most cases, a gradual adjustment of the prices. Okay, there's one more thing I want to show you, and that was we can talk about a supply shock as well. So the idea is that we can think about what we call an adverse, a bad supply shock. Let's think of, for example, we could have a hurricane that knocks out all productive capacity, knocks out our electricity, makes things more expensive. Or very often we think about bad harvest, let's say a flood or a drought. And you'll see what happens here. We have a shift in the supply curve, in a sense due to the technical conditions here, not due to expectations, but due to something that has happened in the economy. And you'll see what happens. We have an upward shift. We get a decrease in output and an increase in prices. Or alternatively, if we have a favorable shock, and I should mention also that we can think of these shocks, one of the biggest examples of these shocks would be an oil price change. So for example, the reduction in oil prices that has happened over the past several years, many people regard as a favorable supply shock that has meant more output, and that has also meant lower prices. So once again, this tool will give you it gives you perhaps a more realistic view of the short-run aggregate supply curve. But in terms of money and prices, the long-run story is basically the same. We're just modifying the short-run story. And then we're also adding another dimension in addition to demand shocks here, which we're assuming come by money supply. But as we'll find out, it's not exclusively from money. There's other things that can change demand, and you learned about them when you did the ISLM model. You can be government spending, but in addition, we also looked at supply shocks. Okay, so now I want to mention one more thing before we end this video, and that is that ultimately we will be moving on to something called the Phillips curve, and there's some readings about that in your book. I just want to mention that what we call the modern version of the Phillips curve is in fact just a reformulation of this short-run aggregate supply curve. It's rephrased a little bit differently, but it captures the same idea, and we'll be talking about that. Okay, I hope I haven't taken too long. Thank you.